student. I am Professor Smita Jha from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm here to discuss some of the important aspects of Victorian era. And today the caption is The Self and the City. The Victorian era in Britain was dominated by the reign of Queen Victoria. Although it was a peaceful and prosperous time, there were still issues within the social structure. The social classes of this era included the upper class, middle class, and lower class. Those who were fortunate enough to be in the upper class did not usually perform manual labor. Instead, they were landowners and hired lower class workers to work for them or made investments to create a profit. This class was divided into three categories: royal, those who came from a royal family; middle upper, important officers and lords; and lower upper, wealthy men and business owner. The expansion of the middle class during this time was due to the rapid growth of cities and the economy. It was also referred to as the bourgeois and consisted of those who had skilled jobs to support themselves and their families. Merchants and shopkeepers became popular occupation as trade, both domestic and overseas, flourished. The large scale of new industries such as railroads, banks, and government meant that more labor was needed to make sure the cities were able to function. The white-collar professionals had the ability to move up in the corporate rankings and earn a higher salary. It was helpful to have connections to those in powerful positions, as they were able to get jobs more easily. Moreover, the middle class was also divided into two categories: higher level and lower level. People from lower middle class typically worked for those in the higher level. The working class consisted of unskilled laborers who worked in brutal and unsanitary conditions. They did not have access to clean water and food, education for their children, or proper clothing. Often, they lived on the streets and were far from the work they could get, so they would have to walk to where they needed to get to. Unfortunately, many workers resorted to the use of drugs like opium and alcohol to cope with their hardships. The underclass were those who were helpless and dependent on the support of others. The poor and young orphans relied on donations to survive. Some women who were unskilled and could not get any jobs became prostitutes in order to make a living. As they were extremely controversial, Parliament voted to pass the Contagious Disease Act, which allowed prostitution in military towns but meant the woman had to be forcibly checked for diseases. The act was meant to protect the men from contracting diseases, not the women from being harmed. This mistreatment created a strong feminist movement among Victorian women who yearned for fair treatment. Finally, in 1885, Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which raised the age of consent and prohibited the use of brothels. During the Victorian age, there was an early baby boom, which led to not only an increase in population, but also an advancement of industrialization. The progression of England as a society led to a greater demand for labor from both adults and children. Children took on hard working jobs as coal miners, chimney sweepers, and domestic servants. Child labor became an overarching issue in the early 1800s due to a lack of effort to improve working conditions by the upper class. Because the government was influenced by the wealthy to invest in luxury rather than promote protection for laborers, many children suffered at work. The most brutal form of child labor took place in coal mines. Children were required to work 12 to 18 hours a day in mines that were infested with rats and disease and had poor ventilation. Such harsh working conditions led to the development of respiratory problems and an increase in mine disaster casualties. The term illegitimacy became popular in English society as the population continued to expand. Many parents, especially those of lower class, were unable to support and account for their children due to poverty and unstable marriages. It was also common for individuals to have children out of wedlock. A child was considered a bastard in a case where the male would leave all support and care of the child to the female. Bastardy became an issue for children, led to an unstable home life, and more importantly, limited equal opportunity to education. As a result, the bastardy clause was enacted to issue relief for illegitimate children. However, it enhanced the illegitimacy of children. As the poor women could not afford to support their children, most chose to work as servants and lived in their employer's home without their children. Their wages would pay these other women, called baby farmers, to raise their children. The system functioned well until industrialization and urbanization led to a greater need for different kinds of paid fosterage. Mothers were determined to keep working in the city as wages were higher, but chose to keep their children in villages and towns with total stranger where conditions were safer. Unfortunately, this form of abandonment led to worsened treatment of children and prolonged child labor. By using his writings as a means to defend the vulnerable people of the Victorian era and criticize the societal structure of the time, Charles Dickens was a huge contributor to several important social reforms. The social conscience he developed in his adult years led to some of the most influential pieces of literature the Victorian era had seen, such as Great Expectations, The Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, and more. Although he was not the first to use his skills in writing to address the issues in English society, he was by far the most successful. Dickens was able to bring to light a serious issue that England itself could not see, and with the spread and increased fame of his work, people everywhere were beginning to see that something had to be done. Thomas Hardy was one of the first realist novelists of the Victorian era. His use of powerful emotions and pessimistic views was highly criticized because no one had ever read something like it before. Most novelists up to Hardy's point were laid back, accepting natured optimists. Works such as The Return of the Native, Far from the Madding Crowd, and Tess of the D'Urville introduced characters with such intense emotion, whether it was slightly comedic or very tragic, that most writers before him failed to do. Hardy was also considered a social critic of sort, identifying the low standards of living that the poor endured in the industrial cities. The mix of realism and social criticism in one style of writing was the reason why Thomas Hardy was one of the most influential and important authors of the Victorian era. George Eliot was a third author who used literature not simply just to entertain, but also to inform people of the condition of people in the society around her. Growing up in a hectic and interesting environment herself, she used her stories to study how environments, especially social environments, affect people and their character. Eliot, who was a fan of art and its origins, believed that any form of art should be based on life rather than other piece of art. For instance, The Mill on the Floss was taken and modeled from her real-life experience of being rejected by her friends and family for her common-law marriage. Although she was also an influential author of the Victorian era, she criticized authors like Dickens and Austen on their styles of writings. During the Victorian era, men and women searched for an ideal relationship based on the expectations of a demanding society which was influenced by all these said religious and political factors. After reading the researched expectations of men and women of the Victorian era and relating them to Wilde's two works, readers can acknowledge the effect the expectations have on these characters, especially the man. Analyzing the character in Oscar Wilde works show how the expectations of society affects the characters' behavior and their reaction to society's ideal. Oscar Wilde examines the impact of Victorian society's unrealistic expectations on the individual in the importance of being earnest, and the picture of Dorian Gray showing how rejection, whether from a potential partner or society as a whole, can lead to deceit and engaging in a double life in order to satisfy convention. Typically, women were also not allowed to be educated or gain knowledge outside of the home because it was man's world. One critic, Richard D. Altick, states woman was inferior to a man in all ways except the unique one that counted most, her femininity. Her place was in the home on a veritable pedestal, if one could be afforded, and empathetically not in the worlds of affair. Patriarchal society did not allow women to have the same privilege as men. Consequently, women were ascribed the more feminine duties of caring for the home and pursuing the outlets of feminine creativity. Victorian men also expected women to possess feminine qualities as well as innocence. Otherwise, they would not be of marriage potential. In Charles Petry's article, Victorian Women Expected to be Idle and Ignorant, he explains exactly what the Victorian man was looking for. Underquote, innocence was what he demanded from the girls of his class. And they must not only be innocent, but also give the outward impression of being innocent. White muslin, typical of virginal purity, clothes many a heroine with delicate shades of blue and pink next in popularity. The stamp of masculine approval was placed upon ignorance of the world, meekness, lack of opinions, general helplessness and weakness. In short, recognition of female inferiority to the male. The expectations men had for women caused women to prepare for marriage and gave women hardly any freedom. The men's expectations pressured women to be the ideal Victorian women's society expected them to be. The women had to prepare themselves for what was to come of their lives, and it determined their future. If a woman did not meet the expectation of the Victorian male, she would end up spouseless. Petry's article states, from infancy all girls who were born above the level of poverty had the dream of a successful marriage before their eyes, for by that alone was it possible for a woman to rise in the world. Because women were denied the opportunity to work or take part in a man's world, they spent their formative years in preparation for marriage. They expected the men to take care of them and provide for them since they were unable to provide for themselves. Just as men had expectations for the ideal Victorian women, the women and the rest of the society had expectations for the ideal Victorian man. Ingrid Ranham's article discusses the modern Victorian language and the roles of both women and men. When discussing men and masculinity, she quotes scholar John Toss. Becoming a man, Toss claims, involved detaching oneself from the home and its feminine comforts and achieving a level of material success in the wider worlds, including the recognition of manhood by one's peer. In other words, men not only had to gain women's respect before marriage, but they also had to impress the rest of society and their male gender. Men become victims of the social pressure because their peers scrutinize their success. Michael Patrick Gillespie, author The Picture of Dorian Gray, What the World Thinks of Me, states that throughout the 19th century, certain values, duty, respectability, commercial success, middle-class morality occupied a central position in the Victorian consciousness. Victorian men were not only competing for respect within their sex, but they needed to impress the women too. If they were not married, it depicted that they were not fully masculine because they did not have a family to support. Supporting a family was a sign of true success. within the male sex. At the same time, however, only marriage could yield the full privileges of masculinity. According to TOS, to form a household, to exercise authority over dependents, and to shoulder the responsibility of maintaining and protecting them, these things set the real on a man's gender identity. Those household responsibilities of protecting, providing traditional and reinforce homosocial recognition and economic success, prescribing the notion that women were born to dream of marriage. Cecily and Gwendolen, from the importance of being earnest, are caught up in the fantasies of the perfect marriage to the perfect earnest husband. Cecily and Gwendolen are fixed on the name Ernest almost as if it were an obsession. It is the ideal name for their future husbands. They are determined not to marry a man unless he is called Ernest, because they believe a man with this name will automatically live up to the name's expectation of being serious, honorable, and moral. According to Walter E. Huston, author of The Victorian Frame of Mind, there are two ways one can be earnest intellectually and morally. To be earnest intellectually is to have or to seek to have genuine beliefs about the most fundamental question in life. In other words, men in Victorian society needed to understand the convention of life and not make mistakes people have in the past. They need knowledge on how to live a successful life. Houston states, to be earnest morally is to recognize that human existence is not a short interval between birth and death, but a spiritual pilgrimage from here to eternity, in which he is called upon to struggle with all his power against the forces of evil. At this juncture, the effect Queen Victoria had on gender roles is very important to study further. She came to represent femininity that was revolved around the family, motherhood, respectability, the idea that the woman's responsibilities were to love and respect her husband before anything and perform all of the duties and chores for the household. Herself, her husband Albert, and their many children became icons of late 19th century middle class femininity and domesticity. During this period, the roles of men and women became more sharply defined than they had ever been in history. Rather than women working alongside the men in family businesses, the 19th century saw an increase in men commuting away to their places of work, leaving the woman home all day to oversee the household. This ideology of men and women occupying separate spheres was supported by the idea that there were natural characteristics of men and women that suited each for different roles. Women, considered physically weaker yet morally superior, best suiting them for the domestic sphere. Women could not seem too focused on finding a husband, lest it appeared they had a worrying amount of sexual desire. Women were meant to only desire marriage in that it allowed them to become mothers rather than for any sexual or emotional satisfaction. Women had no choice but to stay pure until marriage, usually not even being allowed to speak to a man unless there was a married woman chaperoning. Girls typically marry in their early to mid 20s to a groom around 5 years older than them to reinforce the natural hierarchy between the sexes. After a woman married, her rights and property ceased to remain her own. Everything that she owned now belonged to her husband, including her body, property, and money. The responsibilities of upper class and aristocratic women were limited because of the common opinion that they were weak. These women had a range of servants to perform the domestic chores for them, so they usually just had to oversee them. An everyday task of upper class women was accepting and paying visits, as well as organizing dinner parties for their friends and families. These were occasions where women could prove their homemaking skills and good taste, and to serve as symbols to others about their social status. These women were distinguished from the upper class by having less education and fewer opportunities. Most women worked in domestic service, either as a cook, maid, laundress, to a wealthier woman. Other women were employed as barmaid, waitresses, chambermaids, and washerwomen. To be able to go to work, mothers would often pay other women, usually very elderly or very young, to watch their children. Working women could not afford to pay for servants, so besides their actual jobs, they had to do all of the household chores themselves. This was used as evidence to support that women should not belong in the workplace because their families were not being properly taken care of. As is suggested by the sexual double standard, gender was considered to be biological based and to be determinative of almost every aspect of an individual's potential and character. Victorian gender ideology was premised on the doctrine of separate spheres. This stated that men and women were different and meant for different things. Men were physically strong while women were weak. For men, sex was central, and for women, reproduction was central. Men were independent, while women were dependent. Men belonged in the public sphere, while women belonged in the private sphere. Men were meant to participate in politics and in paid work, while women were meant to run household and raise families. Women were also thought to be naturally more religious and morally finer than men, who were distracted by sexual passions by which women supposedly were untroubled. While most working class families could not leave out the doctrine of separate spheres because they could not survive on a single male wage, the ideology was influenced across all classes. Class was both economic and cultural and encompassed income, occupation, education, family structure, sexual behavior, politics, and leisure activities. The working class, about 70 to 80% of the population, got its income from wages, with family incomes usually under £100 per annum. Many middle class observers thought that working class people imitated middle class people as much as they could. But they were mistaken. Working class cultures, which varied by locality and other factors, were strong, specific, and premised on their values. The middle class, which got its income of £100 to £1,000 per annum from salaries and profit, grew rapidly during the 19th century from 15 to over 25% of population. During the 19th century, members of the middle class were the moral leader of society. They also achieved some political power. The very small and very wealthy upper class got its income of £1,000 per annum, or often much more, from property, rent, interest. The upper class had titles, wealth, land, or all three, owned most of the land in Britain, and controlled local, national, and imperial politics. It is also important to look at the religious affiliations of the people at the time. Most Victorian Britons were Christian. The Anglican churches of England, Wales, Ireland were the state churches of which the monarch was the nominal head and dominated the religious landscape, even though the majority of Welsh and Irish people were members of other churches. The Church of Scotland was Presbyterian. There was some religious diversity, as Britain also was home to other non-Anglican Protestants, notably Methodist, Roman Catholic, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and others. At the end of the period, there were even a few atheists. The formal political system practiced at this time was a constitutional monarchy. It was in practice dominated by aristocratic men. The British Constitution was and is unwritten and consists of a combination of written laws and unwritten convention. At the national level, government consisted of the monarch and the two houses of parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The monarchs during this period were Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, preceded by King George IV, 1820 to 30, and King William IV, 1830 to 37, and followed by King Edward VII, 1901 to 10, and King George V, 1910 to 36. During the Victorian period, the House of Commons became the centre of government, the House of Lords lost power, and the monarchy transformed into a symbol of the nation. And the House of Commons consisted of about 600 men called members of parliament who were elected to represent the countries and boroughs of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. England had many more representatives than the other three nations. By its status as first among these four equals, the product of tradition as well as its greater political power and wealth. The upper house, the House of Lords, was populated principally by several hundred noblemen who had life tenures. Members of both houses were wealthy men. Formal national politics was dominated by two major parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. Despite all these external factors during the Victorian era, a man should have been able to live a moral life and recognize the differences between right and wrong. He must also live a spiritual life with God and stay true to his belief of purity and honesty. As historians examining the Victorian era, we are dealing with a 2-century-old world of doctrinarian attitudinizing. So much of Victorian life has been rendered inscrutable by apocryphal sensationalism. A reappraisal, therefore, of Victorian narratives and values is well overdue. Historians like Matthew Sweet have dedicated entire books as discussions of the prolegomena, why we are wrong about the Victorians. The growth of bourgeois dignity fanned the flames of individualism. Growing industries showcase the individual's ability to produce, innovate, and be self-sufficient, the ultimate scope of the human mind. Thrift and individualism were typical Victorian value. Marx, for instance, argued that the emergence of individualism and bourgeoisie had materialistic precursors. Marxists would argue that virtue arose a posteriori from primitive accumulation, from buccaneering, and the intrepid exploits of material imperial mavericks. The Victorian value symptom was complex. It is often misrepresented or misunderstood. Many historians can see past its internal contradiction, and who can blame them? Victorian morality constantly tried to reconcile immiscible opposites: rationalism and superstition, individualism, militarism, science and religion, liberalism and socialism. Yes, individualism was one on the wane from the 1870s onward. Yes, many Victorians grew increasingly enamored with the empire at the expense of personal liberty by 1900. Thus, the identity of and self of the self of Victorian women and men were formed in relation to the city based on several factors influenced by industrialization and religion. With this, I conclude the whole discussion. Let us meet in another lecture with other topic of the Victorian era. Thank you very much.